On March 2nd, 2026, the head of the US Southern Command, General Francis Donovan, flew into Quito to personally meet with Ecuador's President Daniel Noboa, and just 24 hours later, US Special Forces launched ground operations inside Ecuador. Helicopters took off at night, and Ecuadorian commandos raided drug facilities across multiple provinces. Facilities operated by what the US government now calls designated terrorist organizations, a classification that changes the rules they have to abide by. Which is important, because this means that this wasn't a one-off mission. US officials briefed on the campaign said it was the first of what is expected to be a much larger series of raids. This explains why just a week later the FBI opened their first office in Ecuador. This is quite interesting because just 4 months earlier, in November 2025, Ecuador held a national referendum asking its citizens whether they wanted to allow foreign military bases back on their soil, where 60% voted no. And I guess that naturally should bring up the question, back on their soil? Other countries have had bases on their soil and then left? Yes, and this is where it gets interesting. From 1999 to 2009, the United States operated a military base at Eloy Alfaro Air Base in Manta, on Ecuador's Pacific coast. Up to 475 American military personnel performed roughly 100 counter-narcotic surveillance missions per month from that base, contributing to the seizure of 1,800 metric tons of narcotics valued at approximately $36 billion over its operational lifetime. Manta was a key component of Plan Colombia, the massive $10 billion US-Colombian counter-narcotics program that defined American military engagement in the region for a generation. Then Rafael Correa became president. Correa rode a wave of anti-American sentiment to power. In 2008, he pushed through a new constitution that explicitly banned foreign military bases in Article 5, approved by the people in a referendum with 64% support. The last US personnel left Manta on September 18, 2009, but Correa didn't stop there. He expelled the US ambassador in 2011, kicked out US aid in 2013, accusing it of funding opposition groups, and in 2014 ordered all 20 Defense Department employees out of the US embassy. He also curtailed DEA cooperation and dismantled elite police investigative units, creating a massive gap in the monitoring of Ecuador's coastline. Critics argue this is what opened the door for the trafficking explosion that I will soon get into, but supporters argue the US base was never about Ecuador's security in the first place. But anyway, they were kicked out, and now they're back. The question is why? And to answer that, you need to understand that Ecuador was once one of the most peaceful countries in Latin America, but that is no longer the case. See, until 2018, Ecuador's homicide rate was about 5.84 per 100,000, almost the lowest in all of Latin America, and in fact comparable to the United States. But by 2025, it had exploded to more than 50 per 100,000, making it not only the deadliest year in the country's history, but also the deadliest country in all of Latin America. The reason for this is in part due to, stick with me here, bananas. No, I'm not joking. Let me explain this. Ecuador is the world's largest exporter of bananas, shipping over 377 million boxes of bananas per year, mostly flowing through this port, the Guayaquil port. So here's why they're important. Bananas are a high volume, mostly centralized export that also gets priority handling at every point in the supply chain because they are perishable. Some of you might already be seeing where I'm going with this, so let me say it like this. If you were in charge of logistics for a cartel, wouldn't this be exactly the kind of product you'd hide your cocaine in? Well, of course it is. Now, what's interesting is that other Latin American nations also have large exports of similarly perishable goods. Yet somehow, as much as 70% of the world's cocaine supply flows through Ecuador. Which is strange because Colombia and Peru produce almost all of the cocaine, so why not just ship it directly from there? Well, there's 5 ingenious reasons for this, and together they created what is essentially the most efficient drug pipeline on Earth. First is geography. Ecuador is literally sandwiched between the 2 largest cocaine producing nations on the planet, with Colombia to the north that produces about 61% of the world's coca, and Peru to the south that produces is about 26%. Cocaine from both countries crosses into Ecuador through jungle and mountain border regions that are nearly impossible to patrol. Second is the ports that we've already discussed. Instead of building logistics infrastructure, they simply hijacked Ecuador's. The third and most overlooked reason, the dollar. See, Ecuador is one of only 2 countries outside of US territories that use the US dollar as its official currency. For drug traffickers, that's enormous. It eliminates the need to convert currencies, which is one of the riskiest and most traceable steps in money laundering. You earn in dollars, you spend in dollars, you bank in dollars. No suspicious conversions needed. This is why analysts have called Ecuador a money launderer's dream. The fourth reason is weak enforcement. We've already gone into this a little bit, but since Ecuador was never a cocaine producing country, it never built the kind of counter-narcotics infrastructure that Colombia and Peru were forced to develop over decades. It was always the quiet neighbor. And when Korea closed the US military base at Manta and curtailed DEA cooperation, the monitoring gap over Ecuador's 1 million square kilometer maritime zone widened even further. And the fifth reason is what really amplified the whole thing: Europe. See, Ecuador isn't just a transit point for cocaine heading to the United States. It has become the primary gateway for cocaine entering Europe. Ships from Guayaquil head through the Panama Canal, across the Atlantic, and into the ports of Antwerp, Rotterdam, and southern Spain. The head of Europol's drugs unit said it plainly. Ecuador is, quote, definitely the #1 gateway of cocaine coming from Latin America towards Europe. That European demand, which has been growing rapidly, created an entirely separate market that Colombian, Mexican, Albanian, and Balkan trafficking networks all rushed to exploit. And they all converged on the same place: Ecuador's ports, making it the most significant transportation hub the cartels have. And they've come up with 4 methods to transport their cocaine. The first is the cleanest. Traffickers create front companies that look like legitimate banana exporters. They set up shell businesses in the names of people with no criminal background, arrange real banana shipments, and hide cocaine inside the product. Some have even bought existing companies with long histories of clean exports to reduce the chance of inspection. But the more common method is what investigators call contamination. This is where drugs get loaded into containers that belong to real, legitimate companies, without those companies necessarily knowing. Before the container even reaches the port, trucks with hidden compartments pull into pre-port storage yards and unload cocaine into banana containers. Workers at these storage facilities are either bribed or threatened into looking the other way. The third method happens once the container has entered the port district itself. Here, a whole different layer takes over. Freight trucks with drugs hidden in secret compartments drive to known blind spots in security camera coverage. Dock workers break open containers and load the drugs among the legal produce. Then a cloned or fake customs seal is placed on the container to cover the tampering. And then there's the fourth method, which happens after the ships have already left the dock. Here, smaller boats approach the ships as they navigate through Guayaquil's estuaries and hand off packages to contacts among the crew, who hide the cocaine in containers or compartments on board. The entire operation, from plantation to port to open ocean, runs on corruption. Police and military officers have been documented not just looking the other way, but actively transporting cocaine in official vehicles and even providing armed security for drug shipments. An example of one of these methods being used is what happened to Noboa Trading, the banana company owned by the family of Ecuador's current president, Daniel Noboa. Here's what happened. In early 2026, an investigation by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project found that containers belonging to Noboa Trading had been used to smuggle cocaine to Europe. Between 2020 and 2022, nearly 700 kilograms of cocaine were seized from Noboa Trading containers at the port of Guayaquil. Here's the crazy part. Encrypted messages from Balkan traffickers intercepted by European police showed them boasting that nobody but them could load drugs into Noboa Trading containers. To put the scale of all of this into perspective, cocaine seizures at Ecuadorian ports reached 77.4 metric tons in 2022, more than 3 times the amount seized in 2020. Of that total, 47.5 metric tons were found specifically in banana shipments. Okay, I think you get the picture. Pretty much every criminal network, including Colombian and Mexican cartels, Albanian, Balkan, and Italian mafias, among others, have used Ecuador as a quiet transit point for quite a while now. And Interestingly, everyone used to keep things peaceful because peace was good for business. That, however, changed recently because of two events. The first was the 2016 FARC peace accords in Colombia. Let me explain. The FARC stands for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and they were effectively the government in large parts of rural Colombia, especially the coca growing border regions near Ecuador. They controlled who grew coca, who processed it, who moved it, and through which routes. They taxed at every step. It was violent and oppressive, but it was organized. There was one authority. When the FARC demobilized in 2016, roughly 13,000 fighters laid down their weapons. But here's the thing. The coca fields didn't disappear. The labs didn't close. The demand didn't drop. What disappeared was the single operation controlling all of it. So, dozens of smaller groups, FARC dissidents who rejected the peace deal, Colombian paramilitaries, new criminal startups, all rushed to fill the vacuum. And instead of one controlled supply chain, you suddenly had competing factions fighting over territory and routes. That competition is what pushed trafficking southward into Ecuador. Colombia's northern routes were contested and dangerous, so groups started moving product through Ecuador's less monitored southern border and out through its ports. And because there was no longer one group limiting coca production to protect prices the way FARC had done, farmers planted more coca than ever, creating a 76% surge in production. The second event was the murder of Jorge Luis Zambrano, known as Rasquiña, the leader of Los Llaneros. Los Llaneros were the dominant group in Ecuador, and they had an exclusive alliance with the Sinaloa cartel, an alliance that made them dominant as Sinaloa gave them access to cocaine supply from Colombia, connections to international buyers, and the money and weapons that came with being the preferred local partner of one of the world's biggest cartels. In return, Los Llaneros controlled the Ecuadorian end of the pipeline, the ports, the prisons, the routes. When Zambrano was murdered, they lost the person who held the organization together and maintained discipline. The gang therefore splintered into competing factions, each claiming to be the rightful successor. Some of those factions stayed loyal to the Llaneros name and the Sinaloa relationship, but others, Los Lobas, Tigarones, and Chone killers, broke away entirely. These breakaway groups needed a patron. They couldn't compete with what remained of Los Llaneros, if Los Llaneros still had Sinaloa backing. So they went to Sinaloa's biggest rival, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who were more than happy to sponsor them. CJNG had been looking for a way into Ecuador's port system for years, and suddenly a bunch of well-connected local groups with knowledge of the routes and the ports were looking for a new supplier and protector. It was a perfect match. This is what created the ongoing proxy war between Mexico's two most powerful cartels, playing out through Ecuadorian gangs, on the Ecuadorian streets, and inside the prisons as well. Yes, prisons. Gangs literally ran the country's 36 prisons, ordering assassinations and directing trafficking operations from behind bars. It sounds crazy, but it is true. Between 2021 and 2023, at least 459 inmates died in 14 prison massacres. The worst at Litoral Penitentiary in Guayaquil in September 21 killed 119 people. At least 5 were beheaded. I think you get the picture. So let's zoom out for a moment. Ecuador is increasingly becoming more violent, but the reason the US is interested is because of this drug superhighway that has been created here, which begs the question, now that the US is back in Ecuador, what can we expect to happen? Well, I think the best way to figure that out is to look at the best comparison we have, and that is what happened in Colombia, because the setup is almost identical. In 1999, Colombia was in crisis. The FARC controlled roughly 40% of the country's territory. Cocaine production was surging, violence was out of control, and the Colombian government, much like Ecuador's today, was a willing partner, actively requesting American help. So, the US launched Plan Colombia, which I mentioned earlier, a massive counter-narcotics and military assistance program that would ultimately channel nearly $10 billion into the Colombian military over 15 years. American Special Forces trained Colombian battalions. The US provided Black Hawk helicopters, surveillance aircraft, intelligence systems, and weapons. Colombia became the third largest recipient of US military aid in the world, only behind Israel and Egypt. The justification for this was the same thing we're hearing right now about Ecuador: drugs and terrorism. And what's interesting is that technically, Plan Colombia did achieve its military objectives. The FARC was weakened dramatically, their territory shrank, their leadership was killed or captured, and eventually they forced to the negotiating table, signing the 2016 peace deal. By that measure, it worked. But here's what also happened. Between 2002 and 2008, Colombian security forces murdered over 6,000 civilians in what became known as the false positive scandal. Soldiers would kidnap young men, often poor, often from rural areas, kill them, dress them in guerrilla uniforms, and present them as enemy combatants killed in action. This was done because the military was under pressure to produce body counts to justify the billions flowing in from Washington. And the drugs? Well, after $10 billion and 15 years, Colombia is still the world's largest cocaine producer. Production didn't stop. It actually hit record levels in recent years. What changed, however, were the routes. The trafficking moved into Venezuela, into Central America, and most relevantly, into Ecuador. So the very crisis that the US is now intervening to solve in Ecuador was in part created by their intervention in Colombia. The drugs didn't disappear, they just found a new hallway. And there's one more thing worth noting here. Once Plan Colombia started, it never really ended. The US still has military personnel in Colombia, the aid still flows, the cooperation agreements are still active over 25 years later. Once that kind of military relationship is established, it becomes permanent. There's always another cartel, always another trafficking route, always another justification to stay. Now look at Ecuador, a friendly government requesting help, US special forces on the ground, equipment transfers, in the likes of C-130 transport aircraft, surveillance radars, $64 million in M4A1 rifles, terrorist designation for local gangs, joint operations, a status of forces agreement granting American personnel diplomatic immunity. It's the same playbook applied to Colombia just a generation later. And the question that nobody in Washington or Quito seems to be asking is, if $10 billion and 15 years in Colombia didn't stop the cocaine and the trafficking just moved to Ecuador, where does it move next when Ecuador is militarized too? But that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, subscribe down below. See you in the next one.